This week is all about migration, and we're going to look at migration that happens in a variety of different capacities, sometimes voluntary and sometimes not. This infographic is interesting because it breaks down the type of migrants that we see in at least a couple of different ways. So on the one hand, it tells us the total number of people who came from a particular country in a documented fashion, but it also separates out people who have either refugee or asylee status. And refugees and asylum seekers are actually different categories of people, and we contrast them from migrants because migrants is a more encompassing term. So refugees are people who are fleeing from their country of origin and end up crossing a border, to seek safety. So they, cannot live safely in their home country. Asylum seekers are a particular category of people who end up being in, so they will travel to a country to seek safety there. And so this is a situation in which they are either in their destination country or at the port of entry or the border to try to gain access to that particular country. You can also see that this graph shows us the number of immediate relatives that people have within the United States. So for migrants from Mexico, you can see that the majority of them have some kind of familial connection within the U.S. Now, a lot of people assume that Mexico is the largest sending country to the U.S., and that is true. But notice that China also has a much bigger portion of the pie than people often recognize. There are also many other countries that are sending countries, again, to the United States is what we're looking at here, that many people don't tend to hear a lot about or really notice quite as much. It's also very interesting to look at the proportion of refugees and asylees compared to the total number of migrants. Again, refugees and asylees have a protected status, and this means that they cannot live safely in their home country. So there may be a variety of reasons that one country would have far fewer refugees and asylees compared to another. Pew Research Center recently released a report about immigration to the United States, and I wanted to point out just a number of different statistics that came from that report that kind of map onto that graph that we were just looking at. So you'll see here that Mexico is still the top birthplace for immigrants in the United States, but that China is also pretty high up there at second on that list. I want to point out too that India, the Philippines, and El Salvador are also pretty high on that list, and we did indeed see that with the flag graph that we just examined. Another very interesting statistic from the recent report is about Asian immigrant arrivals now outnumbering those who are of Latinx origin. This is kind of going against the common perception. So again, people tend to associate immigration with Mexico, and while that is certainly a large percentage of the immigrant population, it by no means is the majority at all. Another common stereotype about immigration in the United States is that we have an overwhelming amount of undocumented immigrants. But recent data shows us that unauthorized immigrants make up less than 1/4 of all of the immigrants that are out there. There's a lot of assumptions as well about where those immigrants are from, and we do end up seeing undocumented immigrants from all parts of the world. So this is not at all restricted to any specific part of the globe. Related to that stereotype, sometimes you'll hear this kind of common perception that undocumented immigrants are taking over the labor force, that they are quote unquote stealing jobs from Americans. But when we look at the data, the reality is that we've actually seen a significant reduction in undocumented immigrants in the labor force. So over a 10-year period, we saw a reduction of 0.6%. Rather than an increase, which is what the common perception was. And this is also, we need to put this in context of, very significant increases in the labor force in general. I also want to mention that many immigrants have different types of visas to work in the U.S., and that's something that we're examining in our readings for this week. So definitely check those out because they provide some really interesting insight into often very common situations for people who are considered to be legal residents within the United States. All right, everyone, here's the last statistic from that recent Pew Research Center report that I wanted to bring up. And this also connects to one of our readings for this week, one of the context articles that focuses on public perceptions and attitudes and stereotypes regarding immigrants in the United States. Now, very interestingly, we've seen some pretty significant shifts over the course of time. 1994 is a pretty important year for those of us in California. You'll see on the lecture slides for this week that I mentioned that in 1994, the term illegal was used the most in all of the 1990s to describe people, right? And this kind of expressed the very common sentiment that undocumented folks, should not be welcomed into the United States and specifically California. There were a number of propositions that happened that year that were going against things like providing bilingual education, that were against providing public services for folks who are undocumented. So this is even stuff like education. This and healthcare, this was then overturned by the courts because they felt that this was inhumane. So we end up seeing a really significant shift over the course of a couple of decades, right? Where now, because of this 2019 data, it's almost entirely flipped. In fact, it's gone a little bit further than it even was in the opposite direction, where now we have the vast majority of people saying that they believe that U.S. immigrants are a strength to our country, a boom to the economy, and we see less than a quarter, so 24%, arguing that they are in fact a burden. Again, this is that kind of perception of taking jobs, using the resources, that were hard worked for by American citizens. There is still some pretty significant disparities in terms of political affiliation, but you'll see overall, that people have moved more towards being supportive of immigration overall. All right, everyone, I hope this was interesting. Just a little, bit of insight into patterns of immigration, what we're seeing today, and we'll continue looking more into this week. All right, I'll see you online. Thanks so much.